What exactly are you doing parked here? You waiting on someone you shouldn't be? No, I'm reviewing work. This vehicle matches recent theft patterns in the area. Does this SUV actually belong to you, or are we going to have a problem this morning? It belongs to me. My identification and credentials are in my left breast pocket. I'll retrieve them when you're ready. The silence that followed those 4 sentences was the kind that doesn't fade. It presses into you, settles in your chest like a stone dropped in still water, and stays there long after the moment is gone. A large gloved hand had just slapped the roof of an obsidian black SUV on one of the most expensive streets in the city. The sharp metallic crack of it bouncing off glass facades and granite pillars, and the perfectly swept concrete of a neighborhood that did not tolerate inconvenience, did not tolerate disorder, and as it turned out, did not tolerate a black man sitting quietly in his own vehicle without someone deciding that required an explanation. The man behind the wheel had not flinched. He had not raised his voice. He had not reached for anything. He had simply placed both hands open and visible on top of the steering wheel, and he had answered with the calm precision of someone who had spent the better part of 2 decades speaking in rooms where every single word was being weighed, recorded, and held to account. That morning, Officer Barrett Doyle made the worst professional decision of a 19-year career, and the brutal defining irony of it was that he would not understand exactly how catastrophic that decision was until it was far, far too late to do anything about it. He saw a black man in an expensive car on a rich street, and that was enough for him. It had always been enough for him. It would never be enough again. The Alderton Financial District woke up differently than the rest of the city. There were no garbage trucks rumbling through at dawn, no corner bodegas with their accordion gates scraping open against the sidewalk, no clusters of people waiting for buses that ran late because they always ran late in neighborhoods that actually needed them to be on time. Alderton woke up the way old money wakes up, quietly, precisely, and with the absolute unspoken understanding that everything had already been arranged in advance. By 8 o'clock on a Wednesday morning in mid-October, the avenue that ran through the heart of the district was already humming with the particular energy of controlled ambition, the kind you could feel in the way people walked in the clip of leather soles against pristine pavement, in the way everyone seemed to be exactly where they had planned to be, moving towards something specific at a speed that communicated they had not a single minute to spare, and they knew it. The architecture was a deliberate marriage of old and new century-old masonry buildings, with their carved stone cornices and deep-set arched windows sitting shoulder to shoulder with towers of reflective glass that threw the morning light in every direction at once, so that the whole street glittered in a way that felt curated, intentional, almost theatrical in its perfection. The air carried the smell of expensive espresso drifting from the corner cafe where a line of suits was already forming at 7:58, and underneath that faint but present, the metallic cold of an autumn that had arrived early and meant business. There was an invisible taxonomy at work on this street, one that nobody ever wrote down because it didn't need to be written down, because everyone who belonged here already understood it instinctively. And everyone who didn't belong here was made to feel that understanding almost immediately upon arrival. The taxonomy had nothing to do with posted signs or legal restrictions. It had everything to do with the kind of social pressure that accumulates over decades in a place where wealth and exclusivity have been allowed to define not just what a neighborhood looks like, but who is allowed to simply exist within it without being questioned. Delivery vehicles rerouted 2 blocks over during peak hours. Certain kinds of music never drifted from car windows here. Certain configurations of clothing, certain ways of standing, certain ways of being still. They triggered something in this neighborhood, a low-frequency alarm that was invisible and deniable and completely real. The morning light angled hard and golden through the gaps between buildings, laying bright strips across the sidewalk and catching the last of the season's leaves where they had drifted against the base of the ornamental planters that lined the avenue. A woman in a charcoal coat walked past, talking quietly into wireless earbuds. 2 men in matching dark suits stood at the corner, examining something on a shared tablet, their coffee cups held in that identical unconscious way that suggested they had worked together long enough to have absorbed each other's habits. Nobody sat still here. That was the thing about Alderton that mattered, the thing that would become the entire architecture of what happened next. Nobody who belonged here simply sat still because there was always somewhere to be, always a meeting or a building or a client waiting, and the only people who stopped and remained in one place for any extended period of time were people who were waiting for someone else. And even then they had usually arranged for somewhere to wait that was indoors, out of sight, appropriately invisible. A large obsidian black SUV sat parked in a legally designated space near the end of the block. Engine-silent windows, faintly tinted, completely motionless in a way that somehow managed to look both perfectly at home and entirely out of place. At the same time at home, because the vehicle itself was the kind of machine that belonged on this street on the basis of pure cost alone, and out of place, because someone was sitting inside it, still and quiet and not moving. That stillness would cost someone everything before the morning was over. His name was Dr. Elijah Kane, and the first thing you noticed about him, if you were paying attention, was his hands. They were not large hands in the way that suggested physical labor, not the wide, calloused hands of a man who had spent years working with materials that pushed back. They were precise hands, long-fingered and deliberate in every movement, the kind of hands that had been trained over many years to communicate information through their positioning, their stillness, their controlled speed. Because in the rooms where Elijah Kane spent most of his professional life, how you moved your hands was often as important as what came out of your mouth. He was 47 years old, and he had not slept particularly well, which was not unusual for him in the middle of a complex trial week, and he sat in the driver's seat of his vehicle in the unhurried posture of a man who had long ago made peace with the gap between how much rest he needed and how much rest his work actually allowed him. He wore a midnight blue cashmere sweater and tailored slate gray trousers, the kind of clothing that looked simple until you looked at it carefully and realized that simplicity at that level of quality was anything but accidental. On his lap rested a ceramic coffee mug, dark roast, no sugar, and on the passenger seat, face down for the moment, lay an encrypted tablet containing a 73-page forensic toxicology report that he had been cross-referencing against autopsy findings since 5:30 that morning. The report was for a double homicide case that was currently in its third week of trial, and Elijah was scheduled to face a cross-examination that afternoon that he already knew was going to be aggressive because the defense attorney was good and had done his homework and had identified two variables in the blood alcohol analysis that were genuinely worth pressing on, which Elijah respected, even as he had spent the last 4 evenings building the precise sequence of responses that would neutralize each challenge before it could gain traction with the jury. He always did this on Wednesday mornings, 15 minutes in the car before walking into the building, 15 minutes where the only thing required of him was to read and think and let his mind settle into the particular kind of focused calm that the work demanded. It was not a luxury, not in any way. That word usually implied softness or indulgence. It was closer to maintenance, the way an instrument needs to be tuned before it is played, because the work Elijah Kane did required him to be in absolute command of himself at all times. And absolute command of himself required these quiet intervals where the world was held at arm's length for just long enough. He had been the chief medical examiner for the district attorney's office for 11 years. Before that, he had spent 6 years as a forensic pathologist at the City Medical Center, and before that residency and fellowship programs that had taken him through 4 hospitals in 3 states and had exposed him at ages when most people are still figuring out who they are to forms of human suffering that had a way of either breaking a person completely or forging them into something that could withstand almost anything. Elijah had been forged. He was not a man who frightened easily. Not a man who unraveled under pressure, not a man who confused the discomfort of a moment with the danger of a moment, a distinction that in his line of work and in his life as a black man moving through spaces that had not always been designed with his presence in mind, had proven to be one of the most important distinctions he could make. The city moved around the car in its ordinary Wednesday morning rhythm, the sounds of it muffled to near silence by the vehicle's premium acoustic insulation, and Elijah Kane read his toxicology report and drank his dark roast coffee, and did not think about the patrol cruiser that was at that precise moment 3 blocks away and closing. Officer Barrett Doyle had been a police officer for 19 years and 4 months, and there were people in the department who had genuinely respected him at various points during that time, which made the whole business more complicated than it might otherwise have been. He had received a commendation for bravery in 2014, the details of which involved a burning vehicle and a child who would not otherwise have walked away from it. And the department had used that commendation in 3 separate recruitment materials over the years following. He knew the name of the woman who ran the dry cleaner on the corner of his beat, and he stopped to ask about her grandchildren on a semi-regular basis and meant it. He had coached youth basketball for 2 seasons in the late 2000s before the schedule became incompatible with his rotating shifts. He was also buried in a manila folder in the department's internal affairs archive, the subject of 4 separate complaints filed over the preceding 4 years, each one detailing a traffic stop that the complaining party described as having no discernible basis in law or observed behavior. Each one resolved through a process that involved a conversation with a union representative and the notation that the complaint lacked sufficient corroboration to proceed. The people who had filed those complaints were not rich. They did not have lawyers on retainer. They did not have encrypted tablet computers and government credentials, and 11 years of professional relationships with the people who ran the city's legal infrastructure. They had their word against his, and his word had been enough every single time. Barrett was 51 years old and had been working the Alderton sector for 7 years, and in those 7 years he had developed a relationship with the neighborhood that he would have described if pressed as protective stewardship, a phrase that sounded reasonable and responsible and did not acknowledge even to himself that what he was actually doing was enforcing an unspoken social order that had very little to do with the law, and a great deal to do with who Barrett Doyle believed deserved to move through that neighborhood without being examined. That Wednesday morning, he had argued with his wife before leaving the house, a low-grade ongoing argument about money that had no clean resolution and left him with the particular cold irritation of someone who had already spent his emotional resources before 8 a.m. His coffee had tipped in the cup holder when he took a corner too fast and soaked the edge of the seat beside him, and he had not had time to do anything about it except feel the spreading damp through the fabric every time he shifted his weight. He was not in a forgiving mood. And then the obsidian black SUV appeared at the edge of his windshield, motionless at the curb. A black man visible behind the wheel, and something in Barrett Doyle's mind, something deep and practiced and never once questioned, reached for the wheel and turned. Barrett did not run the plates first. That is the detail that matters most, the one that would appear in every subsequent report and review and legal filing. The one that a reasonable officer with a reasonable concern about a potentially stolen vehicle would have done in approximately 45 seconds before getting out of the car. Because if you run the plates and the registration comes back clean, you have nothing. You have a legally parked vehicle that you have no cause to approach, and you move on with your morning. Barrett did not run the plates because Barrett was not operating from a place of procedure. He yanked the steering wheel hard left without signaling, cutting across oncoming traffic in a move that drew a long, indignant horn blast from the sedan behind him, the kind of abrupt maneuver that in any other context would have been a traffic violation in its own right, and he accelerated across the lane and swung the heavy cruiser into position directly behind the SUV, closing the gap until the front of his vehicle sat perhaps 18 inches from the rear bumper of Elijah's car. A placement that was deliberately chosen because it left nowhere to go forward into the vehicle ahead or backward into the cruiser, and communicated that fact unmistakably. He hit the emergency lights. Not the siren, the lights, the red and blue strobes that flooded the interior of the SUV through the rear window, and the side mirrors in rhythmic aggressive pulses that turned the quiet morning into something else entirely. Inside the car, Elijah Kane heard the lights before he fully processed them. There is a particular quality to the silence just before the visual reality of police lights appears in your mirrors that the body recognizes before the conscious mind catches up. And he set his coffee mug into the console holder with a movement so deliberate and careful it could have been practiced, which in a sense it had been, because Elijah had been a black man. navigating American institutions for 47 years, and he understood with a depth that did not require articulation that the next several minutes would require him to be the most controlled version of himself he could manage. He placed both hands at the top of the steering wheel. He watched the mirror. And then, before the cruiser door had fully opened, before Barrett's boots had touched the asphalt, because Elijah was a man who did not survive in his field by waiting for things to happen to him. When he could act first, he pressed the small, recessed button on the left side of his smartwatch with a single deliberate motion, a gesture so minor it would not have registered to any observer as anything more than an idle fidget. The vehicle's integrated camera system, 4 lenses, interior and exterior, front and rear, shifted from standby to continuous active recording mode with real-time upload to an encrypted cloud partition that was associated with his professional accounts and time-stamped automatically by the vehicle's GPS module. He had installed the system 14 months ago and had never once needed to use it in this way. He had always known he might. Barrett stepped out of the cruiser and adjusted his utility belt with both hands in a broad, visible gesture, and then he let his right hand come to rest against the grip of his service weapon, not drawing it, not threatening with it in any legally actionable sense, but resting it there the way you rest a hand on something to remind someone it exists. And he moved toward the driver's side of the SUV at a pace that was just slow enough to feel like the approach of someone who was entirely sure of the outcome. He stopped behind the B-pillar just past the edge of the driver's window frame, so that the person inside would have to crane their neck and expose the vulnerable angle of their throat to look at him. The window came down with a soft electronic sound, and the cold October air and the harsh pulsing of the emergency lights came in together. And Barrett Doyle looked at the man in the cashmere sweater and saw exactly what he had already decided he was going to see. "Morning," Barrett said, and the word was not a greeting in any sense. That word as normally meant, it was a door closing a hand on a shoulder. A way of establishing, before anything else had been established, that this exchange was going to happen on his terms and at his pace and inside his framework of what the next several minutes were supposed to look like. He did not identify himself. He did not provide his name or badge number. He did not state a reason for the stop, which is not a procedural technicality, but a fundamental legal requirement, the absence of which is not a minor oversight, but a significant failure that every officer with 19 years of experience understands perfectly well, which means Barrett knew he was not doing it and chose not to do it anyway. "What are you doing parked here?" he said. "You waiting on someone?" Elijah turned his head, not his body, just his head, with the measured economy of someone who has learned that every unnecessary movement in a situation like this one creates an opportunity for misinterpretation. And he looked at Barrett with eyes that were completely level and gave nothing away, and said, "No, I'm reviewing work." "Reviewing work?" Barrett repeated, and the repetition was a tool, a way of making what someone has said sound implausible by bouncing it back at them, stripped of context and tone. "Yes," Elijah said, "and nothing more." "You have an office in one of these buildings?" "Yes." Barrett paused, letting the silence do work he hadn't earned, and his eyes swept past Elijah and moved across the interior of the vehicle with the practiced scanning motion of someone looking for something to justify what they have already started. His gaze catching on the tablet, face down on the passenger seat, the ceramic mug, the unmarked cleanliness of the floor mats, the absence of anything that gave him what he needed. He found nothing. "Nice car," Barrett said, and he put his palm flat on the roof of the SUV and leaned in slightly, a gesture that served no investigative purpose whatsoever and was purely about the establishment of physical dominance over a space that was not his. "That actually belonged to you." "It does," Elijah said. The two words landed quietly and stayed there. Barrett pulled back slightly and made a show of looking the length of the vehicle, the theatrical inventory of a man performing confidence for an audience of one, and Elijah watched him do it and did not change his expression by a fraction. "Here's the thing," Barrett said, dropping his voice into the lower register he used when he wanted to sound like someone doing a favor rather than manufacturing a pretext. "We've been dealing with a serious spike in high-end vehicle thefts in this sector. Sophisticated operations crews targeting exactly this type of SUV, grabbing them while the owners are tied up inside the buildings. You fit a profile we've been tracking. The word profile entered the air of the October morning and did not dissipate. Elijah heard it, cataloged it, and said nothing. So, I'm going to need to see your driver's license, your vehicle registration, and your proof of insurance. Barrett continued, his hand moving back toward his belt. And I'm going to need them right now. I'm going to open the glove compartment to retrieve the vehicle's registration, Elijah said, and his voice had shifted into something that Barrett could not quite identify, a register that was not quite formal and not quite distant, but carried in it some quality of absolute precision, like someone dictating notes for a record they expected to be read later. And then I'm going to reach into the interior left pocket of my sweater to retrieve my credentials. I'm narrating my movements for your awareness. Barrett watched him do it. Each motion was fractional and unambiguous. The glove compartment, the leather folio, the careful return to upright posture. The two fingers going into the pocket, withdrawing not a single card, but a compact credential case, substantial and clearly official in the way that a laminated card in a grocery store loyalty wallet is not. Elijah extended them through the window. Barrett snatched them in the way of a man who is performing authority rather than exercising it, and he stepped back and opened the folio first, and the registration was there, current and immaculate, the vehicle identification numbers matching the dashboard panel that Barrett's eyes involuntarily checked out of training, and the name was clean, and the address was in a gated residential community whose zip code Barrett recognized as one of the wealthiest in the state. And he shifted to the driver's license, and the photograph matched the man in front of him. And that should have been the end of it. But then his eyes found the credential case beneath the standard documents, and he opened it. The shield was heavy-gauge brass with a deep engraved state seal at its center, and beneath it, behind tamper-evident transparent material, was an identification card bearing a holographic overlay and a title printed in official government typography that was not ambiguous, and was not decorative, and was not something you could order online. Chief Medical Examiner, County District Attorney's Office. Barrett stared at it for a long moment. And then he closed it, and he held it out through the window, and he let it drop carelessly onto Elijah's lap. "Nice try," he said. The two words hung in the cold morning air between them like something that could not be taken back, which of course it could not, because the recording system in Elijah Kane's vehicle had excellent audio capture, and the microphone array had been designed specifically to record clearly through road noise and ambient urban sound, and every syllable of every word spoken near or inside that vehicle for the past 11 minutes had been preserved with timestamp and GPS coordinates in an encrypted cloud partition. And Barrett Doyle did not know any of this. Anybody can order a prop badge and a leather wallet online for $30. Barrett said the words coming faster now with the particular tightness of someone who has heard their own argument even as they are making it, and recognizes on some level that it is structurally unsound but has gone too far to stop. That doesn't constitute verified law enforcement credentials in my sector. Elijah looked at him and said nothing. "I'm going to give you one final lawful order," Barrett said, and his hand wrapped around the grip of the service weapon without drawing it, and his feet shifted wider apart in the stance of a man preparing for resistance, and that is to step out of this vehicle. Right now. He was hoping this was the architecture of it, the part that was most revealing. He was hoping that Elijah would refuse, because refusal would give him a non-compliance charge, would transform a baseless stop that had already accumulated multiple procedural violations into something that looked from a certain angle and in a certain kind of report, like an officer managing a difficult situation rather than an officer who had created one entirely out of his own bias and refused to walk it back when handed a direct opportunity. "Understood," Elijah said. He reached forward and powered down the engine. He removed the key fob from the ignition and placed it deliberately on the center of the dashboard where it was fully visible. He moved his right hand to the interior door release and pulled it, and the heavy door swung outward with a sound like a vault opening, and Elijah Kane stepped out of his vehicle onto the sidewalk of the Alderton Financial District and stood to his full height, which was considerable. his hands open and raised to approximately shoulder-level palms forward, and he remained completely motionless. Barrett had taken an instinctive step back. "I have exited the vehicle as directed," Elijah said. "What is your next instruction?" Barrett unclipped his radio microphone and turned slightly away to call it in. And in the moment that his attention shifted a fraction of a second, the kind of moment that most people would not have identified as a moment at all, Elijah's right hand moved to the face of his smartwatch and tapped 3 times against the glass in a short-long-short pattern. The watch delivered a pre-programmed message to his court liaison: delayed. External incident at logged location. Proceed with opening statements. Will arrive before cross-examination. The whole thing took 2 seconds and left no trace that Barrett could have seen even if he had been watching directly. Elijah returned both hands to their visible position at his sides. Barrett pressed his transmission button. Dispatch. This is Unit 14. I need an immediate priority verification on a county-level credential. Subject is claiming to be. And here, Barrett hesitated, the pause carrying in it the weight of a man who was hearing his own words for the first time at the precise moment of saying them, the chief medical examiner. The radio returned a burst of static, and then the dispatcher's voice: "Copy that, Unit 14. Hold for verification." The city moved around them in its ordinary rhythm. Elijah lifted his left wrist and checked the time on his watch, not out of impatience, not out of anxiety, but because noting the precise time of each escalating moment was the kind of habit that 11 years of forensic work had installed in him at a level below conscious thought, the way a carpenter's eye automatically finds the horizontal even when they are not trying. 11 minutes had passed since the lights went on. Barrett kept his hand near his weapon and his eyes on Elijah and said nothing. The radio silence stretched out past the 30-second mark, and Barrett filled it. He did not intend to, or perhaps he did. It is difficult to say with men like Barrett, where the calculation ends and the compulsion begins. But the silence of waiting, while a man who refused to show fear stood 3 feet away from him, was a kind of pressure that Barrett had not been trained to endure because his entire professional psychology had been built around the assumption that his presence, his badge, his size, his uniform, and his authority would produce a predictable response in any civilian he encountered. And Elijah Kane was not producing that response, and the absence of it was making Barrett talk. "You know what gives you away?" he said, his voice lower now, angled toward the personal rather than the official. The tone of a man who believes he is sharing an insight rather than revealing a pathology. People who actually belong in this neighborhood don't sit in their cars. They walk in. They walk out. They keep moving. You were just sitting there, watching the building. That's not what people do here. Elijah said nothing. "This is a high-value sector," Barrett continued, and his free hand gestured broadly at the glass towers and the manicured planters and the avenue in general, "and I've been working it for 7 years. And I know what belongs here and what doesn't, and when something doesn't fit, it's my job to take a closer look. That's not bias. That's pattern recognition. That's 19 years of experience telling me something is off." The microphone array on the vehicle's rear camera was capturing every word at a sampling rate of 48 kilohertz. Elijah's eyes moved slowly from Barrett's face to Barrett's badge, reading the number there with the same methodical care he brought to reading a laboratory report, memorizing it without appearing to memorize it, because Elijah Kane had long understood that the most important thing you can do in a moment like this one is not argue and not plead and not even resist it, is simply to record, because records are what the truth is made of when the moment is over. "Your car is too clean," Barrett said. "Your clothes are too pressed for someone who just came from somewhere normal. And the way you answered my questions, that's not how regular people talk to cops. Regular people get nervous. They explain themselves. You sounded like you were reading from a script." Elijah looked at him steadily and did not speak. The red light on the camera mounted inside the vehicle's rear panel blinked once every 3 seconds in the rhythm of continuous upload. Barrett did not know it was there. The radio crackled. "Unit 14, this is dispatch, be advised." The dispatcher's voice came through the external speaker at normal volume, which meant that the two of them and the cold October morning and the ambient sounds of the Alderton Avenue all received it at the same time. And something in the quality of the voice, a careful professional neutrality that is specifically different from the casual shorthand of a routine traffic verification, caused a shift in the air between them before the words themselves arrived. Credentials for Dr. Elijah Kane are fully confirmed and flagged as highly restricted. Subject is the active-seated Chief Medical Examiner for the District Identification Number Delta 902. I am showing a priority alert linked directly to the District Attorney's Executive Office. Unit 14. The dispatcher paused a half beat. Do you have an active homicide scene at your location requiring his immediate presence? The radio went quiet. Barrett's thumb fell off the transmission button. And then the world did something strange. It did not slow down because the world does not actually slow down. That is a thing that happens inside a person's nervous system and not outside it. But the effect was the same, which is that every detail of the next several seconds arrived with a weight and clarity that normal moments do not carry. Barrett looked at the credential case in his hand. He turned it slightly, and the morning light caught the state seal in the center of the brass shield and threw a small, bright reflection across the knuckles of his right hand, and he stared at it, the way you stare at something that is in the exact place you were told it wouldn't be. He looked up. Elijah Kane had not moved. His hands were still at his sides, open and visible, and he was looking at Barrett with an expression that contained no triumph and no anger, and no satisfaction of any identifiable kind, only the particular quality of patience that belongs to someone who has been waiting a long time for something they knew was coming. Across the street, a woman in a charcoal coat had stopped walking. She was looking at them at the police cruiser with its lights still strobing uselessly at the tall man in the cashmere sweater standing with his hands open at his sides, at the officer holding a credential case whose brass shield was catching the light, and she had her phone in her hand in the way people hold their phones when they have not yet decided what to do with them. Elijah lifted his left wrist and checked his watch. The motion was entirely calm. It recorded another timestamp. Barrett looked at the credential case, then at Elijah, then at the credential case again, and a visible pulse began to beat against his collar, rapid and uneven. The kind of thing that happens when the body processes something the mind hasn't caught up to yet, and the silence between the radio's last word and whatever came next stretched out past the point where it had any right to stretch. Somewhere 2 blocks over, a car horn sounded and faded. A gust of October wind moved a few dry leaves across the pavement between them. Barrett's hand, which had rested against the grip of his service weapon for the better part of the last 8 minutes, dropped away from it entirely and fell to his side. And the change in his posture that accompanied that movement was comprehensive and sudden and irrevocable, the physical equivalent of a structure losing its load-bearing wall. Everything that Barrett Doyle had believed about this morning collapsed at once. The man who had spent the last 14 minutes manufacturing authority out of nothing had nothing left to manufacture it from. And what remained in his place was a 51-year-old officer in a damp uniform, standing on the sidewalk of one of the city's most visible public streets with the credentials of the county's chief medical examiner in his hand, and no viable explanation for anything he had done since he turned his steering wheel left without signaling 40 minutes ago. Dr. Barrett said, and the word came out wrong, came out too high and too fast, like something that had been under pressure and finally found a gap. Dr. Kane, we had received a general description. A vehicle matching this profile had been flagged in morning communications. No, Elijah said, just that. One word delivered in the same tone you would use to correct a factual error in a laboratory report, quiet and absolute, and carrying no heat whatsoever, which was somehow more devastating than any version of it that came with heat would have been. You did not receive a report that described this vehicle. Elijah continued, and he began to move not toward Barrett, but the precise movement of a man reclaiming his own space, his own time, his own morning, reaching through the open window to retrieve his credential case from Barrett's unresisting hand, which he did with the unhurried efficiency of someone picking up their own property from a surface it had been briefly resting on. You made a U-turn in moving traffic without cause, positioned your vehicle to block mine. activated emergency lights without establishing legal basis for a stop, refused to provide your identification, and reason for the stop when first approached, declined to recognize government-issued credentials in order to continue a detainment you had no legal standing to initiate, and then ordered me out of my vehicle. Barrett's mouth moved. Nothing came out of it. His shoulders, which had carried themselves at a particular elevation throughout this entire encounter, the elevation of someone certain they held the higher ground, dropped by several inches, in a movement so complete and unmistakable that it looked less like a choice and more like something structural giving way. The credit case disappeared into the interior pocket of Elijah's sweater. Barrett opened his mouth again and managed, I didn't mean to. I know what you meant, Elijah said, and his voice did not rise and his face did not change. But something passed through his eyes in that moment that was specific and human and carried in it the accumulated weight of a very long time, and so does the system that recorded it. Barrett looked at the vehicle. He had not until this precise moment registered the small indicator light in the lower corner of the rear passenger side window, the indicator that if he had known what it meant would have told him the camera array had been in active mode since before he stepped out of his cruiser. He looked at the light. He looked at Elijah. The woman in the charcoal coat across the street had not resumed walking. The emergency lights on Barrett's cruiser were still strobing red and blue against the glass facades of the surrounding towers, painting the whole scene in rhythmic color that felt in retrospect less like a display of authority and more like a signal flare marking the location of something that had gone very wrong. Barrett reached up to press the button on his shoulder radio and then did not press it because there was nothing to say to dispatch that would improve his situation, and he let his arm fall. His right hand went to his badge on pure reflex, the way a person's hand goes to a wound, and he held it there for a moment, touching the metal through the fabric of his uniform, and then he let that fall too. He was sweating. The morning was 43 degrees. Elijah did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice in rooms where the official record was being made, and this was a room, this sidewalk, this October morning, this encounter that had been documented from the moment his thumb pressed a button on his watch, and he had been making official records for longer than Barrett Doyle had been doing, whatever it was Barrett Doyle believed he was doing. "You ran no plates before approaching," he said, and his voice was measured and careful in the way of someone dictating findings, each clause landing with the precision of a scalpel rather than the blunt force of anger you initiated. Contact without identifying yourself or stating a legal basis for the stop you attempted to create, probable cause through fabricated claims about local theft patterns, you refused to accept. Verified government credentials by claiming they were fraudulent, without any basis for that claim, and you ordered a citizen out of their vehicle using implied threat of physical force. Barrett was looking at the ground. His jaw moved. "I want you to understand something very clearly," Elijah said, and here the clinical register gave way just slightly. Not to anger, not to bitterness, but to something that was quieter and heavier than either of those things. Something that had been carried a long time and was now being set down carefully rather than thrown. You didn't stop me because you thought something was wrong. You stopped me because I was sitting still in a car. You decided I shouldn't be able to own in a neighborhood. You decided I didn't have a reason to be in, and not a single element of the law required you to stop me, and not a single piece of evidence you observed gave you reason to believe I had committed or was about to commit any violation of any kind. The emergency lights continued their useless rhythm. When the proof was in your hand, Elijah continued, "You told me it was fake, not because you believed that, because you needed it to be fake, because if it was real, you had to confront what you had actually done and why you had done it." Barrett's head came up slowly, and what was in his face now was not the bluster or the authority or the practiced intimidation of the officer who had slapped his hand on the roof of the SUV 14 minutes ago. It was something smaller and more ordinary, and in its own way more truthful. It was the face of a person who understood what was coming and could not think of a single thing to say that would change it. Elijah looked at him for a moment longer. "My vehicle has been recording since before you got out of your cruiser," he said with audio. "The file is already in an encrypted cloud partition linked to my office. My department coordinates directly with your precinct commander and with the district attorney's office, and I will ensure the complete unedited record is reviewed through the appropriate channels before you finish your shift." He paused, and then he said quietly, in a voice that was almost gentle with the weight of what it carried, "I spend every working day telling the living what the dead can no longer say for themselves. Today, I'll let the camera do the same for me." It was not theatrical. That was what made it land the way it did not theatrical at all. Just precise, just true. Just a man who had spent his professional life making sure that what actually happened was what the record showed, applying that same principle to the thing that had just happened to him on a public street on a Wednesday morning in October. He turned back to his vehicle. He did not look back at Barrett Doyle. He did not need to. The door of the SUV pulled shut with the quiet, absolute finality of a room being sealed, not slammed, not punctuated with force, just closed the rubber seals, meeting the frame with a sound that swallowed all the noise of the street in a single soft instant and returned the interior of the vehicle to its state of complete acoustic insulation. And Elijah Kane was alone again, inside the quiet he had built for himself at 8 o'clock that morning, which felt like a very long time ago now. He pressed the ignition. The dashboard came alive in its arrangement of soft green and amber indicators, the engine settling into its inaudible idle. And he reached for the coffee mug in the center console and found it had gone cold, and he set it back down without drinking from it. And he sat for exactly 3 seconds in the stopped stillness of someone letting a room that has been shouting at you go quiet before you walk back into it. The encrypted tablet on the passenger seat was still face down where he had left it. The toxicology report was still there waiting for him. The discrepancies in the blood alcohol analysis still requiring the precise sequence of responses he had spent 4 evenings preparing. And he had a cross-examination to get to, and a jury to talk to, and work that the dead were counting on him to do correctly. And so he reached for the turn signal and activated it. It clicked 3 times, amber light pulsing against the glass of the buildings beside him, and he checked his mirrors and pulled away from the curb in a clean signaled arc and joined the flow of Wednesday morning traffic in the Alderton Financial District without hurrying and without looking back. Behind him, Officer Barrett Doyle stood on the sidewalk. The emergency lights on his cruiser were still going. He had not turned them off. They strobed red and blue against the glass towers and across the immaculate pavement of the avenue and across the face of Barrett himself, painting him in alternating color that made him look from a certain distance like someone standing at the center of an emergency they had not been able to prevent, which was accurate in every way that mattered. The woman in the charcoal coat across the street had lowered her phone. She looked at Barrett for a moment. Then she resumed walking, her footsteps quick and certain on the pavement, and the morning absorbed her, and she was gone. The radio in Barrett's cruiser was silent. No one called him. He stood there until the obsidian black SUV had moved far enough into the flow of traffic that it became indistinguishable from the other vehicles on the avenue, and then he stood there a while longer, and his hand rested at his side where the grip of his service weapon had been, and he looked at it, and then he looked at the place where Elijah Kane's car had been parked, which was now just an empty space at the curb in the morning sun. It was the first time in 19 years and 4 months that Officer Barrett Doyle could not think of a single thing to do next. At 9:47 that same morning, in an office on the 4th floor of the building that housed the district attorney's operations, a young woman named Deja Rollins was reviewing her email queue when a notification appeared from an automated cloud archive she had set up 2 years ago at Dr. Kane's request and had never once been triggered before. The subject line was a timestamp, a GPS coordinate, and 3 words, active recording review. Deja had worked with Elijah for 6 years, which was long enough to understand that he did not configure automated systems without a reason and did not trigger them without a cause. And so she opened the notification before she opened anything else in her queue that morning, and she accessed the file it linked to, and she watched the first 90 seconds of the footage, which showed the approach of a patrol cruiser in the rear camera. And then she watched the next 60 seconds, which showed the exchange through the vehicle's audio system. and then she stopped the playback and sat very still for a moment with both hands flat on her desk. Then she picked up her phone and called Dr. Kane's number. The call went to his professional voicemail, which meant he was already in the courtroom, which was exactly where he had said he would be. She waited for the tone and said, "I have the file. I'm looking at it now. What do you need me to do?" His text response arrived 11 minutes later between witnesses. "Send it up." "Full chain of custody documentation. Official channel." She sent it up. The file, when it arrived in its complete form, 4 camera angles, synchronized audio captured at 48 kHz GPS metadata continuous timestamp, was 114 gigabytes of high-definition documentation of Barrett Doyle's Wednesday morning in the Alderton sector, and it contained several things that Barrett had not known were being recorded, including the segment where the patrol cruiser sat idling 3 blocks from the SUV's location, and Barrett could be heard on his personal radio line. Not the dispatch system, but a secondary channel asking a colleague, "What's the situation with the Alderton morning beats? You getting pressure to let things slide up there? Because I'm seeing a pattern and nobody wants to hear it." The colleague's response was unintelligible. Barrett's follow-up was not, "If I had $1 for every time someone told me I was being too aggressive in a sector where aggressive is the only thing keeping the profile clean." The sentence ended. They're dropped mid-thought, which meant he had been interrupted or had thought better of it. The digital forensics team would later confirm that this segment of audio had been captured by the vehicle's exterior microphone array, which was designed to pick up ambient sound within a 30-meter radius, and that the recording had begun before Barrett's emergency lights activated, which meant it predated any reasonable claim of a lawful stop and fell entirely within the category of unsolicited voluntary disclosure. By 2:15 that afternoon, Captain Sandra Merritt had the complete file on her desktop and had watched it in its entirety twice, pausing and rewinding the segment where Barrett tossed the credential case back into the vehicle. The particular carelessness of that gesture, the way Barrett's wrist moved, the way the case tumbled through the window, and she had pulled Barrett's internal file, and she had read the 4 complaints she had known about but had never been able to do anything about. And she had read them again, and she had picked up her phone and called the department's administrative liaison. "I need to schedule a meeting with Officer Barrett Doyle," she said, "this afternoon, before end of shift." She did not say please. She did not need to. Sandra Merritt had been a police captain for 6 years, and before that she had been a detective for 9. And before that, a patrol officer for 7, which meant she had spent 22 years in an institution that she understood from the inside with a completeness that most people who critiqued it from the outside did not share, which was exactly why its failures cost her something that simpler forms of outrage could not quite reach. She was not an idealist. She did not believe the department was broken beyond repair, or that every officer with a complaint in their file was irredeemable, or that the problems were simple, or that the solutions were obvious. She had seen too much for any of that. She had also seen over the course of 6 years in this captain's chair 4 separate complaints against Barrett Doyle that had died in the review process, not because they were false, but because the people who filed them had not had the evidence to push them past the first gate, and the first gate was designed not deliberately, not with malice, but through the accumulated effect of decades of institutional habits to be very difficult to push through without evidence. Elijah Kane had evidence. Barrett arrived at her office at 4:22, and he was still in uniform, which told her something about the state of his thinking, that he had not gone home to change, that he had spent the hours since this morning in the precinct building, in a kind of suspended state, waiting for whatever was coming, with the particular dread of someone who knows it is coming, but cannot see the exact shape of it yet. He sat down across from her desk. She turned her monitor to face him, and she let him watch the footage. Not all of it. Just the credential exchange, just the moment where he said, "Nice, try and let the case drop into the vehicle," just that, and she watched his face while he watched it. He looked at it the way you look at something you wish were smaller than it is. "I want to explain the context," he started. "I have the context," she said. "I have 114 gigabytes of it." He tried again. The theft patterns, the sector profile. The morning's communications. The instinct that had served him for 19 years, Barrett, she said, and she used his first name not as a gesture of familiarity, but as a way of collapsing the formal distance to make absolutely clear that what she was about to say was unambiguous and personal, and not a procedural formality. I have pulled every stop you logged in the Alderton sector over the past 4 years. I have the demographics. I have the dispositions. I have 3 of the 4 prior complaints in this file, and I know exactly why they didn't go anywhere. And I am telling you that what is in this recording combined with what is in this file is not going to go anywhere good for you. Or, Barrett was quiet. She placed a printed photograph on the desk between them. It was a frame capture from the vehicle's rear camera, time-stamped, showing Barrett's hand releasing the credential case into the window of the vehicle. The image was sharp enough to read the expression on his face. It was not an expression that communicated reasonable law enforcement action. The camera also picked up audio from your secondary radio line before you initiated the stop, she said. He went very still. The phrase "profile clean," she said, is not a phrase that appears anywhere in department procedure, and it is a phrase that now exists in a formally submitted evidence file linked to a complaint from the county's chief medical examiner. Barrett opened his mouth. She held up one hand briefly, a gesture that closed the door on whatever he was going to say. Effective immediately, she said in the flat tone of someone reading the terms of a document that has already been finalized, you are placed on administrative leave without pay pending formal internal review. I need your badge and your weapon before you leave this building. She slid a form across the desk. He looked at it for a long time. Then he unclipped the badge from his chest and set it on the form, and he removed the service weapon from its holster with a controlled, careful motion and placed it beside the badge, and he sat for a moment looking at the 2 objects on the desk in front of him. And then he stood up and walked out of Sandra Merritt's office and down the hallway and out of the precinct building, and he did it without stopping to speak to anyone because there was no one there to speak to. The hallway was empty in the specific way that hallways get empty when people know something is happening and have decided they were somewhere else. The Civilian Police Review Board had existed in this city for 11 years, constituted with genuine authority and chronically starved of the kind of evidence that authority requires in order to function: the clean, unambiguous, multi-angle, time-stamped, and GPS-verified kind of evidence that you cannot argue around, the kind that does not come down to competing credibilities, the kind where no one can stand in front of a review panel and say, well, it depends on how you interpret the footage. They had been waiting for evidence like this for a while. When the formal submission arrived from the district attorney's office 2 days after the stop, filed through the appropriate channels, accompanied by a brief, precise cover letter from Dr. Elijah Kane that ran to exactly 2 paragraphs and contained not one word of hyperbole or advocacy, just dates and facts, and a reference to the attached documentation. The board opened an investigation that morning and did not wait for the usual procedural delays to stack up. What they found when they looked at Barrett Doyle's complete patrol history was not a surprise exactly, because the patterns were visible if you knew where to look and had the authority to compel the data. But the scale of it, laid out in a complete statistical portrait for the first time, had a weight that individual incidents on their own had never carried. In 4 years of Alderton sector patrol work, Barrett had logged 847 documented stops. 71% of the individuals stopped were Black or Hispanic in a neighborhood whose residential and commercial demographic was less than 12% minority. The stops produced an arrest or citation at a rate of 7%, a rate that the board's analysts noted carefully and without editorializing was significantly below the department average for stops that had met the legal threshold of reasonable articulable suspicion, which suggested in the bloodless language of statistical analysis that a substantial portion of the stops had not met that threshold. 3 of the 4 prior complaints against Barrett were now reopened in light of the new evidence, and the board's investigators reached out to the people who had filed them. The process of reaching them was not fast and was not easy, because people who have been through a system that did not believe them once are not in a hurry to extend their trust to that system a second time, and the investigators understood that and were patient about it. A woman named Cheryl Okoye had been stopped in the Alderton sector on a Tuesday evening 18 months before while driving home from her second job, held on the side of the road for 38 minutes, while Barrett examined her vehicle and released without charge and without explanation. She had filed a complaint the following week that had been marked as lacking sufficient corroboration and closed. She was a registered nurse. She had been in scrubs when Barrett stopped her, and she had missed the beginning of a mandatory in-service training because she arrived late, and that late arrival had gone into her personnel file. She met with the board's investigator for 2 hours, and at the end of it she said something that the investigator wrote down verbatim, and that would appear later in the formal report. I just want someone to say that what happened was real. I'm not asking for anything else. I just want someone official to say it happened. A man named David Sorrells had been stopped 3 times in 14 months in the same sector in 3 different vehicles, each time released without charge. He had not filed a complaint because the 3rd time a friend who had been in the passenger seat told him it wasn't worth it, and he had believed that, and he was still not sure he had been wrong. The board's report, when it was completed 9 weeks later, documented what it called a deeply entrenched pattern of race-based stop-and-detain practices that had been formally noted, filed, and administratively resolved without consequence on 4 separate prior occasions. It named the specific failures at each stage. It named Barrett Doyle, and it named the stops it had taken for someone with the right credentials to make any of this matter. The formal administrative hearing was held 6 weeks after the Alderton stop in a conference room on the 8th floor of the municipal building where the review board kept its offices, and it was a room that felt aggressively ordinary. Fluorescent lighting, a long table, water in a plastic pitcher, the institutional hum of a building that processes difficult things and has learned to look like any other room while it does it. Barrett arrived with a union representative and a prepared statement. Elijah arrived because he had been formally requested to appear as a material witness, and he sat in a chair at the table's end, in the same way he sat in chairs at the ends of tables in courtrooms, with his hands folded in front of him, and his full attention on the person speaking, giving nothing away and missing nothing. The prepared statement Barrett had brought had been written by the union representative and contained several phrases that Elijah recognized from his years of courtroom work. Phrases that performed remorse without committing to a specific account of events. Phrases that introduced mitigating context without conceding that anything requiring mitigation had occurred. It was a competent document. It was also completely incompatible with 114 gigabytes of high-definition video and audio evidence, and the hearing proceeded accordingly. When the board's chair asked Elijah to characterize what the footage documented, Elijah placed a single sheet of paper on the table, a timeline he had prepared listing each procedural violation in the sequence it had occurred, and he went through it without editorializing and without advocacy, and without anything that could be dismissed as emotional rather than factual. When the board's chair asked, "In your professional assessment, Dr. Kane, does this footage represent an isolated incident of poor judgment or something with a longer pattern underneath it?" Elijah looked up from the paper and said in the measured tone of someone who selects their words the way a surgeon selects an instrument, "In my field, we are taught never to draw conclusions from a single data point. The comprehensive documentation this board has compiled suggests that what I experienced on Wednesday morning was not a moment of uncharacteristic poor judgment. It was the most thoroughly documented instance of a pattern that had been occurring long enough to appear in 4 prior complaints, none of which resulted in any change." The union representative objected to the characterization. The board's chair thanked him for his input. The board deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the chair read the findings without preamble. Barrett Doyle's conduct on October 18th had violated departmental policy in 8 specific enumerated ways, and the totality of the evidence, the incident itself, the prior complaints, the statistical analysis of his patrol records, demonstrated a pattern of conduct incompatible with continued service. His law enforcement certification was revoked. His pension accrued over 19 years was subject to forfeiture under the Municipal Conduct Clause, which the board recommended the city's legal team review for full application. The matter was referred to the district attorney's office for evaluation of potential civil rights charges. Barrett Doyle sat at the table and looked at the water pitcher, and the water in the plastic pitcher, and the condensation on the outside of the pitcher, and he did not speak, and no one on his side of the table spoke either. And when the session was formally adjourned, he stood up, and the union representative put a hand briefly on his shoulder and then took it away, and Barrett walked out of the conference room and down the elevator and through the lobby and out into the October air. The same October air as 3 weeks ago, the same color sky, the same smell of the season turning, and he stood on the sidewalk outside the municipal building without a badge and without a union and without 19 years of a career and without anything to do next that he could think of. The street moved around him in its ordinary way. Nobody looked. Cheryl Okoye received a formal written apology from the department 8 weeks after the board issued its findings, a document on official letterhead signed by the interim commissioner, acknowledging that the stop she had experienced had lacked legal basis and that her complaint had been improperly closed. She read it at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning before her shift, and then she set it down and made a cup of tea and stood at her window for a while, and later she told her sister that it was not the apology she had needed, not really, but it was something, and something after nothing. For a year and a half was its own particular thing. David Sorrells did not receive an apology. He was not technically within the scope of what the board's findings had formally addressed, and the machinery of institutional accountability has edges that leave people on the wrong side of them without much recourse. He knew about the investigation because it had been reported in the local paper, and he read the article twice, and he told his daughter about it, and she asked him if he felt better, and he said he wasn't sure, and that was honest. The 3 civil complaints filed by Okoye and 2 other individuals whose prior complaints had been reopened were settled by the city's legal department without proceeding to trial, a standard outcome in cases where the evidentiary foundation is solid enough that a public proceeding would produce more cost than the settlement in every sense of the word cost. The settlements were structured with non-disclosure agreements attached, which Okoye's attorney negotiated down from their original form, though not eliminated. The reforms that followed were procedural rather than transformational. A modified stop documentation protocol requiring officers to log the stated legal basis for a stop before activating lights with a GPS timestamp mandatory at the moment of log entry. But they were real, and they were in writing, and they were trained to every officer in the department over the following quarter. Inside the department, the protocol acquired an informal name that nobody had officially bestowed on it, and that appeared in no memoranda, but that circulated the way things circulate in institutions through the unofficial channels that exist alongside the formal ones. They called it the Kane Protocol. Not everyone who used the name knew the full story of where it came from. Some of the younger officers thought it was named for a procedure originating with someone long retired, some abstract historical figure whose exact circumstances had faded. The older ones knew. They did not speak about it much. Barrett Doyle applied for 3 private security positions over the following 4 months. Each application required a background disclosure, and each disclosure led to the same outcome: a phone call from a human resources department, a brief silence, a carefully worded decline. The last rejection came via email at 11:17 on a Thursday morning, and the subject line was Application Status Update Decision, and the body of the email was 2 sentences, and Barrett read them and then closed his laptop and sat in his kitchen for a while before standing up and doing something else. What that something else was, no one who had known him in uniform could say, because there was no one left in his professional life who was tracking it. He had been for 19 years a man who watched other people. Now he was not being watched by anyone. He came back to the same street on a Thursday evening 6 weeks after the morning that had changed Barrett Doyle's life, and had in its own quieter way changed Elijah's too, though not in the way that the word changed usually implies disruption and surprise, more in the way that a thing you have been carrying for a very long time finally gets set down in a specific place and you can feel exactly where it was resting. The legal parking space was open. He pulled in and cut the engine and sat with his hands in his lap, which was different from the Wednesday morning 6 weeks ago when his hands had been at the top of the wheel, positioned for visibility, positioned for survival. Now they were just resting, which was different enough to notice. The street was quieter in the evening. The glass towers had dimmed the sharply dressed parade of the morning, replaced by the more scattered movement of people heading home, the energy of the avenue lower and more human. The streetlights were beginning to compete with the last of the October daylight and winning gradually the way things win in the absence of dramatic confrontation simply by persistence. Elijah did not take out his tablet. He did not open a report. He had a full day of work behind him and another one in front of him, and he had given what he needed to give to the process that had followed the morning. And now he was doing the thing he always did when a case was closed, sitting with it, not to process it further, but to let it become the past rather than the present. He thought about Cheryl Okoye, whose name he had learned from the board's report. He thought about the people whose names he had not learned and would not learn, the ones who had driven away from stops like the one he had experienced, and had gone home and put it in a box and continued their lives, because continuing your life is what you do when the system has made clear it has nothing to offer you in exchange for your complaint. He pressed the button on his watch, not to activate anything, just to feel the small raised edge of it under his thumb. Elijah Kane did not consider himself a hero. He knew he had resources that morning that most people who face what he faced do not have: credentials, documentation, professional relationships, the particular armor of a title that a system would be forced to take seriously. That knowledge did not make him proud of what had happened. It made him grateful for the outcome and honest about what the outcome meant, which was that the work was not finished, and it would not be finished for a long time, and the least he could do was show up tomorrow and do his part. Barrett Doyle is no longer a police officer. His law enforcement certification was formally revoked 91 days after the Alderton stop. The pension he had spent 19 years accumulating was subject to a clawback proceeding that ultimately resulted in a partial forfeiture, enough to matter not everything. He lives in the suburb where he had always lived, and his name no longer appears on any department roster anywhere in the state. 3 applications to private security firms produced 3 rejections. A 4th application to a firm whose screening process was less thorough produced a conditional offer that was withdrawn the same week the board's public findings were indexed in the searchable misconduct database that the state had launched the prior year. He is 51 years old, and he has time now that he did not have before. Captain Sandra Merritt was appointed to the position of Deputy Commissioner of Professional Standards 14 months after the Alderton incident, in a process that did not publicly cite the Doyle case, but that everyone involved understood had been shaped by it. In her remarks at the ceremony, she said that the hardest part of police leadership is not identifying misconduct. It is building institutions that do not require a specific set of extraordinary circumstances in order to respond to it. She did not elaborate on what those circumstances had been. Cheryl Okoye is still a registered nurse. She still works 2 jobs some weeks depending on the season. She keeps the apology letter in a folder in her closet. She does not reread it, but she has not thrown it away. David Sorrells bought his daughter a used car for her birthday the following spring. He drove it around the block with her twice before handing over the keys. He told her to keep her registration in the glove box. She asked why. He said, "Just always know where your papers are." She took the keys and drove away, and he stood on the driveway and watched her go. Dr. Elijah Kane still parks in the same spot on Wednesday mornings. Nobody stops to ask him what he is doing there. What happened on that October morning in the Alderton Financial District was not unusual. That is the part that is hard to sit with. Not that it happened, but that it happens regularly and routinely to people whose names we never learn in moments that are never recorded in complaints that are filed and filed again and closed again until the person filing them simply stops. Not because the truth has changed, but because the machinery that is supposed to respond to it has made clear in the only way institutional machinery can make clear anything, that it has already decided how much the truth matters. Elijah Kane had an encrypted camera system and a government credential and 11 years of professional relationships with the people who run this city's legal machinery. Most people don't have any of that. And the question that stays long after the board's findings and the protocol changes and the settlement letters and the career consequences, the question that a story like this one earns the right to leave behind, is this what happens to the ones who don't? What happens in the moments that no one records? Have you ever stood in a moment like this one where you called something out and refused to let it go, or where you waited and let the truth find its own way to the surface? Either way, I want to hear your story in the comments below. I read every single one. If this one stayed with you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel because these stories deserve to be told, and we're not done telling them.